Now, with that said, let's move to the polysans.
Okay. Are you comfortable standing?
Yes.
Or would you?
Yep.
Okay. So we've also touched on the polysans, and like the bacterials and the saniakeels, they are immune system intelligence enhancers. They hold up the magnifying glass. But the thing that I love about this, and we said this earlier, is that they work in terms of the concept of the terrain that's associated with different disease conditions. So Dr. Spengler's tremendous insight in the 1920s was that when a person has a particular disease condition, and there's focal infections, there's tuberculosis, there's rheumatic conditions, there's cancer, that the way that the physiology of the body changes, the way that the terrain changes, encourages the pleomorphic progression and the growth and the community affinity of particular clusters of species. So the bacterial remedies are one particular species that stimulates an arm of the immune system. The saniakeels are even a little more specific. They focus on a particular pathogen. These are communities, these are clusters. So with, I believe with one exception for the M for malaria, that these are all communities that in the bottle contain the antigen signatures, the immune system information packages for different spectra of pathogenic flora associated with that disease. And one of the nice things about the polysans is that there's a very simple, very elegant in-office way that you can empirically test for this. Because a person's blood, if they have formed antibodies to this cluster, will agglutinate, will actually form little crunchy plates of blood rather than a smooth mixture of blood when it's mixed with a drop of the appropriate polysans. So in a little while we're going to show you a film clip of a demonstration of exactly that process. And it's a way, I love empirical methods, because as smart as we are, and as much as we learn, there's so much more that we don't know. And as insightful as we are and as experienced as we are, the body is always going to dish out surprises to us. And every time you have the chance to go in and ask a question empirically of the body and say, okay, I've come this far, you show me what's true. That's when you get not only good therapeutic results, you get the bullseyes, you get the absolute matches. So the polysans are always used diagnostically, and with a few exceptions, they can be used therapeutically, but they're never taken internally into the body. They're always done percutaneously with a drop or two that's rubbed on, and this has the advantage of stimulating immune responses to the entire floral spectrum, the entire cluster of community that's associated with the milieu that arises from and then is in a cycle supporting different disease conditions. Okay?
Exactly. So with the polysans, let me give some a little bit of detail about each of them. The live demonstration is great because what it will do, the live video demonstration that you see, it's going to outline the steps on actually how to actually do the testing. Let's give some understanding about what the remedies are for. So polysan A, what I wanted to do here is just read quickly. Stuart's talking about communities. So polysan A, what the actual remedy is, the constituents that make up this polysan A remedy: antigens from Mycobacterium tuberculosis type bovis, Mycobacterium tuberculosis type brevis, and antitoxins from highly immunized rabbits. So these are the types of things you see a lot of the mycobacteriums in combination within these remedies. The other thing that's interesting is sometimes you'll treat with one remedy. Let's say we've done a test. We've done our blood test, our agglutination test, and we found that there is 3 that are having a high level of agglutination or a reaction to that remedy. And we only choose one of them that seems appropriate for the patient at that time. We come a month later and we test again, and we found that actually a lot of the other stuff has cleared as well, because a lot of the remedies, the constituents within the remedies actually overlap, and so sometimes using one will clear quite a few different things. So when we are talking about the polysans, just from a very practical perspective, it's basically these old toxins from either inherited or a miasmatic origin, or from something that you've been exposed to, so an acquired toxin. And when you're clearing this, a lot of the time what you're finding is you're clearing that tendency, especially from a miasmatic perspective, you're clearing the tendency, that family history or trend as to being able to set yourself up or your patients up so that they're not necessarily going to have those tendencies and be able to stay a lot healthier. The other thing too is it does help to explain Polysan M is for malaria. And you test it, and as Stuart says, we're asking the body to tell us what is going on. We're not guessing. And when Polysan M shows up and somebody says, but I've lived in Canada for my whole life, I've never been exposed to malaria, how is this possible?
Haven't lived in the tropical parts of Canada. Yeah.
Exactly. So, and as tropical as it gets, Vancouver is that, right?
Right.
But it's, again, remembering latent miasmatic inherited potential tendencies as one aspect. So it could be from colonial British living that there was some great ancestors that were living in more tropical countries or tropical areas. Okay, so
another possibility is that there's antigenic overlap with other hematological parasites. I mentioned earlier Dr.
right.
Stephen Fry's lab and discovering an organism they've tentatively named FL1953. It'll eventually be given a name. That's its laboratory, Fry Labs 1953. That is very similar to malaria and seems to be extraordinarily broadly distributed through the North American population and is carried by mosquitoes all over and is not necessarily dependent upon the deep tropical zone. So there are other possibilities
that
as well.
actually explains it, because I remember I was in testing in a clinic with a variety of practitioners, and 5 out of the 10 all had Polysan M, and most of them had never been traveling, and so then that could be a very good explanation as to why that is. So, okay, so let me review these quickly. Polysan A, I love this describer, complaints due to old age. It's things like metabolic disturbances, arteriosclerosis, hypertension, cardiac afflictions, nervous disorders, prosthetic disorders, so things you tend to see as the more chronic degenerative stuff that happens that's more related with the aging process. Polysan D and DX. I'm actually going to come back to these because these ones are definitely used mostly as diagnostic rather than therapeutic. Polysan E, they talk about it from a luetic perspective, so from the syphilitic miasmatic perspective. Polysan G tends to do with colds and flus, and then also cardiovascular circulatory. Polysan K is also the other really big circulatory remedy, circulatory disturbances, venous congestions, varicose veins. Polysan M we've mentioned as malaria. Polysan OM is benign and malignant neoplasia. One of the things I've tested a lot and found in younger women that this is one that shows up quite frequently. So when we talk about benign aspects, we're also talking about fibrotic processes of fibrosis, specifically uterine or breast. And so kind of potential precursors, let's say, to future neoplasia. Polysan R is for rheumatism, and Polysan T is tuberculosis. D and DX. D is for an active focal infection, and DX is for a latent or quietly ember glowing focal infection that's hiding deep within the body. And so when we are testing with those, we don't necessarily want to be using them as remedies to provoke these latent infections or these focal infections to flare up, but rather to understand that they're there and then use patient history and symptomology and also the Polysan remedies to be able to clear those underlying roots of what these focal infections are all about.